Currently, the bill has a complete removal of Planned Parenthood from the Medicaid program, and that's nationwide. So what this means is unclear for Alaska, but a third of patients losing care is a big deal and is scary. Our patient volume is twice as much as almost all of the other health centers combined for these services. Do they provide all the services we provide? Not every healthcare center that provides birth control provides the full range of it. Is there a place to get an IUD? And a lot of health centers have a cap on how many Medicaid patients they'll take. And if they've already reached that cap, then where are those patients going to go?
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the Alaska State Director for Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates, Rose O'Hara-Jolly. Planned Parenthood itself is a series of 600 health clinics across the country. Alaska has 2 clinics, one in Fairbanks and one in Anchorage. They provide reproductive and sexual health care, including birth control, sexually transmitted infection testing and treatment, cancer screenings, and mental health care. Planned Parenthood is the only provider of abortions in Alaska. Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates is separate from the clinics and is an advocacy organization tasked with keeping the Planned Parenthood clinics open and accessible. As head of that organization, Rose directs all of Planned Parenthood's advocacy in the state, including legislative lobbying, electoral engagement and endorsed candidate programming, local organizing, and youth leadership development.
Rose O'Hara-Jolly, welcome to the podcast.
It is so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
I had a very distinct childhood. The older I get, the more I realize that. I am one of 7 siblings. I was born on Seminole land in North Florida. I was the second of my moms. Eventually there would be 7, but I'm the only one with my dad. I spent half of my year with my mom in North Central Florida and the other half with my dad, where he was at the time. That would be the occupied territories, the Gaza Strip, northern India, Australia, Mexico, Hawaii, Aspen, Colorado, Germany.
What did your dad do?
My dad built community playgrounds out of recycled materials. And so he would go and live in a community and work with the kids around what play was. So he'd want to be in a community at least 6 months. They would design the playground together with the kids. And he would teach the families how to construct the playground, and they would build it together. So the idea being that even in these places where people felt so divided, what they had in common was they wanted a better future for their kids.
Who paid him to go live there for 6 months to integrate, etc.?
It's a great idea. So hence the Aspen, Colorado. He would work the other 6 months in a wealthy country and explicitly state that the cost of his labor was twice as much to cover the cost of us to then go and do a project in another country.
That is really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
I guess it worked for him.
Yeah, it worked for him and it worked for me. Talking to my mom, she's like, none of the other kids could have done it, and I joke with her all the time. I lived in all these war zones. She's like, they weren't active war zones when you were there, just in between.
It's just you and your dad going to these countries.
Yeah, it would just be me and my dad. So I would go from living in a 2-bedroom house with tons of siblings sharing a room with my brothers to only me and my dad on our own living out of a backpack. So, you grow up as a kid and I knew it was unique, but now the older I get, I'm like, this was a very unique experience.
Were your siblings in Florida jealous of your experience?
That's a very good question. I think not, because I don't think they had any frame of reference, and it also is pre-Instagram, and I'm not going to I'm not in Bali with my dad at a private hotel. Yeah, so it wasn't I was doing all of these magical things in my mind. I think it is a huge part of how I got here. Both of my parents, I'm looking at it now, my little sister just had a baby and how they always talk about 3 generations to break the trauma. And I hit the parent lottery where I got 2 parents who actively worked through breaking that trauma to raise me. I see that work in me and how much they overcame and unlearned. My dad's side of the family, I wasn't allowed to go visit them until they took the Confederate flag off the flagpole in their front yard. They are white supremacists. Like, they are the KKK. And so he completely removed himself from that life, unlearned all of that. My mom did as well in differing ways. And, they came to this agreement to raise me out of love, even though they weren't together.
And your mom had 5 more kids later.
Yeah, there are 7 of us. 2 of us are adopted. My older sister and me have the same mom, different dads. Then we have 3 younger siblings, same mom and dad. And then my mom's best friend passed away, and we adopted her 2 kids into our family.
Oh, okay. Got it. Back to your dad. One more question, because it's a very unusual profession to be a playground designer doing this international work. How did he advertise to get the jobs in the wealthier places and in such a way that people were willing to pay double?
I was a kid, but the way I remember it is there are these wealthy people all across the world who have ties together, especially in countries like India with different caste systems. So there would be a woman there. She was from a wealthy family, like very radical, far left, right? And so she's like, I have these wealthy friends across the globe, like, those sorts of networks. There are a lot of people with a lot of ties, especially he started to work through UNESCO and the children's rights and the work that the UN is doing. That would give him connections as well.
What I'm guessing is it was really the first job that mattered. And then from there, it could grow. Yeah.
So the first playground, he met my mom because he was my older sister's kindergarten teacher. And so one of the first playgrounds he ever built was there. And so it kind of just went from there.
In Florida.
He was just doing like play environments for kids, and think of the 70s and how cool but radically unsafe. Way high up in a tree. I have memories of being a kid very high up in trees. And so it kind of evolved from there. And the more people kept asking him, he eventually got an architecture degree. So he could work with kids to build things that were fun and exciting but safe to make sure that they didn't get hurt. So he's a playground inspector. He was fully inclusive. So a lot of designs that we'll see around now on playgrounds to be inclusive of different abilities, designs my dad and his colleagues created in order to make them that way. But mostly they were environments. Kids across everywhere love water. They love moving dirt. They love being in trees, right? And then having things that they can make their own spaces. So then integrating that with equipment to help kids get strong and balanced and work together.
Does he still do that?
He passed away when I was a teenager.
Oh.
Yeah.
I guess that had to have been pretty traumatic.
Yeah. Could be a whole... I've been on other podcasts around death talking about all of the trauma and experiences I've had around losing family members over the years. It continues to be really hard. To hit the dad lottery when so many other people don't, and then to have navigated my adult life without him, and also all the fun we would have kept having together.
Do you mind if I ask how he passed away?
I didn't want to know for a really long time because I was a teenager and I felt like he could have done something probably. But recently, my grandmother did tell me that it was a heart attack.
You continue to have contact with your paternal side of the family?
I did speak with my grandma. She passed away as well. His brothers are... There's a reason he kept me from that side of the family. And at my grandmother's funeral, I go, and my dad had a brother. They were 10 months apart. And he walks in, and it's like the ghost of my dad. Looks exactly the same. Long hair, long beard, walking with a cane, cowboy boots, cowboy hat. I have this moment of this whole part of my family has been kept from me. And I could have had this connection to my dad. And my mom leans over and is like, I can't believe they were going to have 3 separate funerals because this 3 or 4 living kids couldn't be in the same room together.
Wow.
They make it through. We go graveside. My uncle had all of his white supremacist biker buddies do 2 loops around as they're trying to pray over my grandma. Not what she would have wanted. My 2 other cousins, as they're lowering her, get into a fist fight next to the casket. Start screaming at each other. Everybody has to leave. And I was like, my dad made the right choice. I was like, you made the right choice.
You've talked a lot about the experiences you had with your dad. But the other 6 months were with your mom.
My mom has defined me so much. She raised 7 kids on $4.75 an hour. Minimum wage, even now, is nothing in the South. I have no idea how she made that work. So many of us have stories of moms who were like, how did you make this work?
So she was working minimum wage jobs.
Yeah.
Full time.
Mm-hmm. Well, as much full time as you can with, watching one of us is sick, and our mom having to make that decision. Do I lose an entire day's wages and maybe this job, or do I send you to school sick?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a decision she wants to have to make and one she was forced into. And I watched that happen just time and time again for whatever reason, even as a kid. Like when we were on Medicaid and then Clinton decided we weren't poor enough anymore and kicked us off Medicaid, saw always that as a failure of our government and our neighbors and our community, not a failure of my mom.
What kinds of work did she do?
She worked in the front office of Shan's Eye Clinic until she went into labor with me. Then she worked in the front office of an amazing community healthcare center in Brooker, Florida, Acorn Clinic, that provided care to everyone who walked in, mostly tobacco farming country over there. She worked the front desk there until she went into labor with my youngest sister, and then later went back and worked on the dental side of that healthcare clinic.
How did you get out of Florida?
My mom always said she knew I was going to leave and never come back. I had always wanted to move to San Francisco or New York. I just was like, that's where I wanted to be, San Francisco, mostly. And then my partner said absolutely not to San Francisco.
So you had a partner in Florida?
Mm-hmm. For like 10 years, from like teenager to like 30.
Okay.
And we moved to New York City together. And I fell in love with Brooklyn. I loved it there. It's such an amazing time.
Did you identify as queer growing up in Florida?
I feel like, I was the last one to know. Like, I got made fun of massively in middle and high school and was always like, and then like kissed my first girl at 16. And I was like, oh, okay. I guess everyone else saw something in me. But I did identify as queer, which was very upsetting to the older lesbians in my community.
Oh, so you started identifying immediately as queer, never as a lesbian.
Yeah.
And what was the thought process around that? And what was the conversations like with the lesbian community?
Yeah. So my thought process was that I felt that my queerness wasn't just a sexual orientation, but like a political statement, especially around the culture of anti-transness that was happening. Still is happening, but especially...
When were you born?
I just turned 43.
Oh, happy 43rd birthday. I guess I just want to like put it into perspective, like what year we're talking about. So that's like late 90s, early aughts.
Late 90s, early aughts, when I realized that I'm queer, and I wanted it to be very clear to the community what that meant to me. And that if you wanted to know who I was attracted to and loved, then you could have a conversation. But by me saying I was queer, I was letting you know that you didn't have to tell me, and I still found you valid. That I still was going to be here for you. The older lesbians basically just wouldn't talk to me. Very classic in the South, like on the outskirts of town. There's like Biker Dyke, that's what they would say they were then. Lesbian bar next to the like Leather Daddy bar. I would go there with my friends and no one would talk to me, and I'd talk to all my friends. It was very much like, no.
Why do you think?
I can't really speak for why generation and current generations.
I mean, I've read Stone Butch Blues, like Leslie Feinberg. This is not my wheelhouse specifically, but thinking about, I guess, like historically, like the lipstick lesbians and the bull dyke lesbian. I mean, words that we don't normally say anymore, but like
that's how they identify
that was
themselves.
their culture. Yeah. And mirroring a heterosexual relationship. It's really hard to talk about that stuff now with the lens we have today without saying like, man, these people had some serious issues going on.
Yeah.
In terms of their own self-acceptance and self-hatred and what they could accept and not accept.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful it's not an experience that I can relate to. I come from an incredibly loving family. Like, I never really came out, which is like, to our generation, people are like, what? And now Gen Z is like, we don't come out. It's not necessarily something that you have to rail against and define yourself as not. Like, I feel like now we get to define ourselves as what and who we are. So much has changed. The fear and discrimination that I have felt pales in comparison to the generation that came before me. I have a lot of privilege. I'm sure it probably did hurt to see a young kid whose family didn't cast them out and they never really had to say anything to begin with, you know? Like, I just like brought a girl to the bar once with my brothers, and like that was the conversation. You know what I mean? No one batted an eye. There was no, oh, you're this now. It just was like, okay. I've dated men again, and everyone's just like, okay. Also dating trans men and how the community reacts to that is a whole other
How the
podcast.
lesbian community reacts?
Well, just like the erasure, right? And it's like now it's like if that person does not want to be publicly trans, then now they are a heterosexual couple, also on the brink of the least amount of safety, depending on how that happens. And so I find all of that just really interesting of how, and to go to safety, right? Another thing is like, I am tiny. Like, I am small. So as a queer person being small, people aren't as afraid of me. If I was taller and on the genderqueer spectrum where I was born male and existing very feminine, I would have a completely different relationship to safety than I do right now.
When did you start identifying as non-binary and using they, them pronouns?
That was when I was 30 in New York City. That's when people were starting, at least in my spheres, to use they, them pronouns. I have a friend, Mike, who has fiercely loved me in amazing ways and does use his white male privilege to get me into gay spaces. He's like, they are non-binary. This is also their space. They get to exist in this space. And I was really apprehensive. And he was like, we'll just try it in the house, you know? And just that little bit, like the feeling of just, I don't even know how to describe it. Like something between euphoria and a boot coming off your neck, you know, like simultaneously realizing that like I wasn't wrong, like she, her, and he, him, because I considered fully transitioning at one point.
Prior to using the pronouns.
And I was like, neither of these feel right. Neither of these are working for me. And so then having something that worked, and not just worked for me, but like inside the community, when people used it, I knew they really saw me, right? They weren't doing it because it's politically correct. You know, they were doing it because they saw me and loved me. And so I started using it just in the queer community in Brooklyn. And then I moved to Cantwell, Alaska, and still was, but, you know, was kind of in some ways like figuring out my safety around my identity in this new space, which also like the interior, it's great.
I want to talk about Cantwell. Before that, I want to just jump back one more item on this issue. You said Mike would have to advocate for you to have you as a non-binary person included in LGBTQ spaces.
Mostly in like gay male-dominated spaces, like at a party or something like that. And he would be like, they have just as much of a right to be here. Like that is a part of their identity because of that kind of like transphobia, gender.
Right. And I want to talk about that for a moment because I don't think that is talked about that much. You know, when I was in college, so I'm 7 years older than you, but when I was in college, we had GALA, Gay and Lesbian Association.
Yeah.
And then it was a big deal for us to make it B-GALA. And then by the time I was a senior, it had become, they changed the order. So we had B-GALA, and then it was L-BEGA, lesbian, bisexual, and gay. So we changed the order. And then the year after I graduated, it became L-BEGATA to add the T in.
Done this to ourselves.
But but it happened in like this sort of like, I mean, literally my freshman year, it was GALA. So it was like this progression of changing it around and acknowledging that the gay men have been in charge for long enough. Let's sort of switch it up. But even today, knowing that there's anti-trans bias in the lesbian and gay community and really trying to separate themselves and say, that's not us. I can't make excuses for them, but I have like my own thoughts on it, that they were just born at the wrong time. for me, there was absolutely gender nonconforming was the problems that I had as a small child. I was gender nonconforming from age 3 to age 13. Then there was this new identity associated with sexual orientation that I sort of latched onto. But the gender nonconforming part came first. It is part of my story. And I believe it's really probably part of a lot of their stories too. So the idea that these are separate identities that don't have any interaction is just not accurate.
Yeah. I mean, and that's part of why I do honestly believe that people are so afraid of the queer community, is because we show the possibilities of what it's like to really be yourself. And that's scary, especially for people when they have been told their whole life they can't, also under the same threat of violence that I'm sure both of us have felt for being ourselves. And so then there's just a lot of anger there when subconsciously you probably do wish you could do and say and be other ways. But the other thing with discrimination inside the community is like, we're born this way. And so if everyone's born this way, it means you get all sorts of ethnicities, cultures, races, socioeconomic status, political beliefs across the gamut. And so it's a shared experience and also not a shared experience. It allows for people to isolate themselves inside that experience. You couldn't take your oppression and apply that over here to this other person and how they might be feeling. So it's not unique to the queer community. Like, lots of people silo themselves into like, I'm the exception, or my group's the exception, and that other group is lazy, ignorant, like whatever you want to say.
Well, I'm going to make a confession, and it's not one that I'm proud of. In spite of my own personal reflection and me acknowledging that I have this whole gender nonconforming history, I get a lot of anxiety about misgendering, and it's just like part of so many decades of not having they, them as an option. I mess up a lot, and I have a lot of anxiety about messing up. And I've done it with you. I've accidentally used she, her pronouns. Can you talk about that experience from your perspective, and I guess any advice for listeners who also have anxiety about making a mistake about something that just feels really different and outside of what their norm?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak for everyone else. I can only speak for myself. There are times where I'm more tender than others about it, so it might not be the same. I will say quickly that I use they, them pronouns, and then I was encouraged to apply for a job at Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates. I applied for that job, and one of the first things you do is fill out your email signature. And I was sitting there staring at it, and I was like, am I going to put they, them? And I was like, it is what is right, but what about my safety at work? If I put myself out there and people don't follow it, how's that going to feel? But I was like, okay, for whatever reason, I don't know why, because all logic says don't tell your boss, right? So also for background, I almost got fired from the New York City public school system for having a girlfriend. People don't realize how recently that was still considered problematic behavior, and looks like we're going back that way again with school districts. So don't be honest with your job.
Yeah, so what were you doing in the New York City School District?
Oh, I was a kindergarten teacher.
Like your dad?
Yeah. At a fully inclusive school. It was an amazing school. I loved it there. But something told me to put my pronouns in my email signature, and I was like, no one's going to look at it anyways. Then I kind of that confession, like, I don't know if I would have been as brave and bold if I had known what it had actually meant, that I soon would become one of the most public figures using they, them pronouns in the progressive movement, or kind of definitely in the interior.
So was that how you got to Cantwell?
No. That's
Okay.
why I left Cantwell.
Sorry.
I went to Fairbanks for the job. But just to say,
Okay.
like, I hadn't intended to be that brave or that out, and I got thrust into that. So then there was also a lot to go to your feelings of misgendering.
Mm-hmm.
At first, I had a lot of grace because I was like, language is hard. As someone who, grew up trying to speak other languages, like there is a learning curve, and I think the difference is learning curve versus willingness to learn versus continuing to make the same mistakes. And so at first I'm just like, we're going to have grace here. It's different, but then it's like, are you using that as an excuse? Are you saying like, well, I'm old and this is hard? That's not okay. There have been people always on the right side of history throughout history. Even when it was so far from the cultural norm, they still got it right. So you can get it right. After a while, are you still making the same mistakes? Or are you noticing them and actively trying to do it? One thing I have people do is I'm like, it is disrespectful to like misgender anyone. If someone uses she, her pronouns and you say they, them, like everyone deserves their gender to be honored. But to take a month and only refer to people that are not right in front of you as they, them, and it like really can work to like retrain your brain because we're used to that, right? Like, oh, they left their wallet here. I don't know who they are.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then you just start to realize that your brain actually does that all the time. And it's just like helping it to find that place to keep doing it. Basically, I didn't intend to be that out. That was an accidentally hard process for a little while everyone was getting their feet under them to be able to do it. But now I feel really honored that I was a big part of that process, hopefully for others now to not have to go through such a huge learning curve. I will say, and this is great because I've been wanting a public place to say this, I think I've been misgendered more since the day Trump got elected than in the past 5 years. Like 100%. And by people who know me, who work with me. Almost nobody does pronouns or native lands at the beginning of any meetings now. And for me, it's just like, was it all performative? By others who aren't the most impacted by these tiny graces. With so many of us being erased, and like especially trans people, those things that maybe felt a little performative, like go back and perform them. Let them know you haven't forgotten that like we exist. You haven't forgotten that Indigenous people are still here in Alaska fighting every day for their subsistence rights, for their land rights. And so just saying like, I see you in a time like this, for me personally, doesn't feel disingenuous, doesn't feel like virtue signaling. It feels like I did that because it made you safe and comfortable, and I'm not going to stop doing it. So just a little call in for maybe people to notice, like if, because that's another thing. If you like misgender me and immediately just go, like, check. That's all I need. You noticed. You know what I mean? Like, you're not erasing me. Your brain just had a glitch. Right. Like, I do present a lot more femme these days. I'm not under any guise around how we're all going to magically unlearn decades of entrenched gender stereotypes into our brains and just be like, we're done with them now. It's just not how it works.
100%. And it's interesting just hearing you talk about presenting more femme now, as I've grown my first beard ever and am presenting more butch now.
I love our ideas of femme and butch. Like, look at us. I started tucking in my shirt.
But I touch on that because your performance of gender changes over time.
Yeah, and mine has changed a lot. And I think that's another piece that is hard. One thing that I think the youth are doing so good with is owning that, right? I really didn't think I could reinvent myself. I was like, this is who I've been. This is the kind of queer I am. And if I start wearing different clothes, this was like a kind of mini crisis I had where I was like, I actually want to change up how I look. And I know that what I'm supposed to do as someone born female in a tiny body who's genderqueer is that I'm supposed to present as much masculinity as I can to like prove to you that I am non-binary. And it's like performing that for others for their mental safety and clarity and not actually existing in how I want to be.
Right. And as you're talking about that, I think about conferences and things that I've gone to where I don't see a lot of it in the legislature, other people using they, them pronouns, but in other spaces that I exist in, people do use they, them. And there are times where it comes through my head, I'm like, they don't look like they're using they, them pronouns. Like where I make a judgment on their physical appearance in front of me, being like, there seems to be nothing they, them about what I'm seeing. But I guess to your point, it really doesn't matter. It's their choice.
Yeah. I appreciate your honesty because I think a lot of people do like owning those thoughts, right? Like they're there not because you're a bad person. They're there because society has drilled in us that like gender. I mean, that's the other thing. Gender is performative by everyone.
What's RuPaul's quote?
Oh yeah, we're all born naked and the rest is drag.
The rest is drag.
But, all my friends are getting Botox. They're getting, lip fillers. You're all making yourself the person you want to be to the outside world.
Right.
It's just one is accepted and one is unacceptable. But back to yours, I definitely feel like right now people would be like, they, them, is that just trendy or whatever?
That is the argument that's made by lots of
yeah.
folks on both sides of the aisle. This is like a trendy thing that happened in the early 2000s that's kind of gotten out of hand. Too many people, it's the stats can't be right. There can't be this many people identifying that way. And that was part of the argument against gender affirming care because of certain bills that went through. I read so many studies from the Netherlands and the UK and Sweden looking at denying certain treatments because of the fear that some teens might be changing their mind, as all teens do.
Yeah. One, it's a conception of like what is causing harm, right? And we know from the statistics that what is causing harm is not letting, especially trans kids, like explore who they are, right? Because we're also not talking, that's the other lie, right? We're not talking full on, complete, every form of possible transition with minors. We're talking about giving them the therapy, the space, and maybe the hormone blockers to do that exploring, to not make a definitive decision. That's not what's happening, right? It's giving them the space to figure out who they are, which is what we should be doing to every single child, teenager and person. Like, give them the space to figure it out, not have these strict binaries. Transition means something different for every person in the trans community. It just means something different medically as far as how they would like to pursue that. But really what it is their decision to pursue. And that's, I also am of the opinion that, kids are people too. And teenagers also have the same human and constitutional rights to make decisions for themselves. There's not some magic fairy dust at 18 years old that suddenly makes you better at making decisions. My entire 20s are proof of that. I made bad decisions.
What's a bad decision?
Oh, well, what 43-year-old me would consider a bad decision is the fact that I rode my bike around Brooklyn without a helmet on for like 20 years. You know what I mean? Like, that's a bad decision.
How did you get from New York City to Cantwell?
It's a very classic Alaska story. My partner of a decade had a full-on affair. I kind of lost my mind because of it. Like, my life fell apart. I had been working my dream job, but it's New York City, like a wildly stressful job. I was also a curriculum developer, working on all these amazing curriculums for the city of New York and then eventually beyond. But I was just like, I hit a wall. And I had one of those New York City jobs that even when you're on vacation, they find you and they call you. And two of my brothers worked for Denali National Park. And they kept wanting me to come visit. I came and visited. There was no cell phone service or internet at the time where they were. I completely unplugged and realized that I was ready for something different. So I came for a couple summers, bought my first car, got rid of everything I owned that wouldn't fit in an Impreza, and drove to Alaska with two of my best friends.
And settled in Cantwell.
Yeah.
But what was the job and why Cantwell?
So I didn't have a job. I actually didn't work for a couple years, which is wild. My friends are in Denali National Park, so I met people like in the area, right? So basically I made friends, and I had a friend who owned the hostel. She was like, I don't want to stay here all winter alone. You want to stay with me? So we just stayed together in the hostel. I'd never skied before. I'd never ice skated. I learned how to ski, ice skate, snow machine, mush. Just completely fell in love with such a different pace of life from New York City. And I fully recognize that it is like an extreme to go from like hipster Brooklyn to like Cantwell, Alaska in the winter.
Had you saved up money or were you living super low budget?
Super low budget, right? So I wasn't paying rent. I was helping people over the winter with their places. It was just helping in ways that people needed help for other things. And I grew up really poor. So not a lot of places to spend your money in the Alaskan interior to begin with. So it's not like I wanted to see that concert. We all were just doing the same puzzle together.
Right.
So I wasn't a high overhead.
Gotcha.
And I had saved up, I think, I want to say like $5,000 to $7,000 and lived off that for 2.5 years.
Wow. That's impressive. And then you moved to Fairbanks for the job with Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
What was the decision to do that?
Morgan Lim, who you know, had previously been the temporary organizer for PPAA in Fairbanks. And
What's PPAA?
Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates.
Okay.
So the advocacy side that I work for.
Mm-hmm.
And I had come up to a couple of events from Cantwell, and he immediately was just like, you clearly have organizing experience. Because I had, been in movement work, like from my dad and my mom, all the way up and through. I got my true start with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Farm Workers' Rights Organization out of South Florida. He was just like, apply. At that point, I was working summertime temporary construction and loving it. Where I was like, you can always just say no, just apply, and then you can say no. And then I got the job, didn't say no, moved to Fairbanks, and keep somehow taking on more and more responsibility at the job. Now being the state director. I was the field manager after organizer.
What year did you start?
I've been there 7.5 years.
Can you talk about what Planned Parenthood is versus Planned Parenthood
Alliance Advocates. It's confusing. And we've merged a bunch. So Planned Parenthood are Planned Parenthood health centers, what everybody thinks of when they think of Planned Parenthood, been around over 100 years, providing high quality, compassionate care around sexual and reproductive health. They are a doctor's office. I always say your dentist isn't out here having to defend their right to give you treatment around cavities. Not only are medical providers not allowed to engage in any political activity, because abortion has been politicized, we are in this really unique position. In order for Planned Parenthood health centers to stay open because of political attacks, a new branch needed to open to work in politics to make sure that happens. Ultimately, we are there to advocate for our health centers to stay open amongst these onslaught of political and policy attacks.
When you started working 7.5 years ago, Juneau had a clinic. Saldana had a clinic. So we've lost 2 since you've been there. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how Planned Parenthood's been functioning over the past 7.5 years?
Yeah. So again, our health center side is not the side that I am on. Right. We have completely other staff, CEO, making decisions as healthcare professional. On our side, on the advocacy work, I really saw an incredible, beautiful trajectory towards change. Working in Fairbanks, not only did my organization not ever have a full-time person there, but a lot of other advocacy organizations that do similar work don't. So moving into that space and really being like, what's possible in Fairbanks, the whole time I knew, I was like, I live in this community. I live in these communities. The representation on the school board, on the assembly, does not actually represent the beliefs and values of people in this community. I am very proud of the work that my team and other teams did, especially in Fairbanks. Right now, the borough mayor, borough assembly, and the borough school board are all reproductive and sexual health majorities, which is incredible and something people told me would not be done for a very long time. So, and then we have the same in Anchorage, right? Mayor, borough, school board, and in Juneau. So the 3 largest areas have 3 branches of government fully in support of things like sex ed and reproductive health care.
My pushback on that is that when Sarah Palin ran for Wasilla mayor the first time, she ran sort of on a pro-life platform, which lots of people have pointed out, the mayor of Wasilla doesn't decide whether abortion is legal or there's access to abortions in Wasilla. You know what I'm saying? It was kind of it wasn't really part of her wheelhouse. It definitely fired up her base and was something that expressed her values, but it wasn't applicable, really.
Yeah, no. And I do appreciate you bringing that up because we will hear this from candidates a lot because it is valid in a lot of spheres. But first and foremost, there is no sex education in the state of Alaska, and that is directly linking into our sexual assault, our intimate partner violence, our STI rates. So having a school board willing to bring in sex ed, which is one of our core issues, is 100% like something that we need school boards to be doing for the health and safety of everyone, but especially youth in this state. Then we have other things where I always love Rumsfeld and the unknown. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know.
That one haunts me, the unknown. As someone who is very strategic and forward thinking, there's always these things. And so the unknown was COVID. And we really saw how having really strong reproductive and sexual health and healthcare professionals in positions of government that prior wouldn't have been seen as needing that skill set or having that power. So looking at Anchorage's home rule and like how that really changed it. And COVID's not, sexual and reproductive health issue, but it is a healthcare issue. And so having people in that space ready to have conversations around healthcare in this new world that we are in with like the Medicaid cuts, et cetera, having people who believe that reproductive healthcare is a right and necessary for healthy communities, we're going to need mayors, city assemblies, and city councils that are thinking in new ways as not only Planned Parenthood, but others are losing Medicaid funding. Where are these new ways that cities and municipalities and others can step in, right, and fill that gap that is inevitably going to be left by the federal government for the health and safety of their communities? So on the surface, no, but then in reality of good governance is you need to look at what's in your power and how you help your constituents.
Well, I think there's no doubt that in most people's lives, it is the elected officials that are closest to their lives, which would be the Anchorage Assembly, the Anchorage Mayor, the Anchorage School Board for folks in Anchorage. Their decisions are affecting what's happening on your street.
Yeah.
Like it's really comes down to that. And so I appreciate the fact that you guys acknowledge that local elections are extremely important and grateful for that. I want to talk about abortion history in Alaska. I believe we legalized abortion in Alaska prior to Roe v. Wade. It passed the legislature and was vetoed by the governor, and then the legislature overrode the veto. What's fascinating is that there were actually more votes to override the veto than there had been to legalize abortion in the first place. And there was an unusual, alliance happening because it was moderate Republicans and non-Catholic Democrats advocating for legalization. Nick Begich the first, who was a Democrat in the Alaska Senate at the time, who was opposed.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my understanding of that
was
part.
Great. Yeah. And no, I definitely find like which I mean, in government and the override, and my punk in me would probably go and just vote to override something I hadn't voted for just to be like separation of powers. But
Exactly.
We made this decision. It's not yours to make. Alaska was one of 4 states pre-Roe to legalize abortion. And then you have this period of abortion being legal when there was around, I want to say from the 80s to the early 90s, there was 13, 14 abortion providers in the state of Alaska. And then you get to the mid 90s. And that's when you really start to see the culture war.
Right. In which the moral majority and Jerry Falwell kind of started in the early 80s with Reagan. And prior to that, Republicans, abortion was not their issue.
Completely manufactured. Yeah. And they admit that. I think it's Rumsfeld, right?
Right.
He's like, we got on a call and we narrowed down what could be the most divisive single issue vote. And we landed on abortion, and then we made it that way. It was not politicized before, hence why Planned Parenthood existed as healthcare centers and healthcare centers only, you know, and not also an advocacy organization to keep them open. So that predates my time here in Alaska. But it does seem like where that really picked up, not just from looking at health center closures or service closures, but talking to a few people who were here during that time, is that in the mid 90s, it really went from we did this service and sometimes people were upset about it till we were targeted.
And there was an organized movement. And that's around the time that Sarah Palin ran for mayor of Wasilla, and that was her platform.
Oh, okay.
So it all ties together.
Connects.
Yeah.
So then you see less and less providers very quickly. In 1997, there was a court case from the Wasilla Pro-Choice Coalition, I believe, was one of the litigants. When I saw that, I was like, a Wasilla Pro-Choice Coalition. And that is a court case that solidified that there is a constitutional right to abortion.
Well, Dave Kurtula was like a giant of the Alaska state legislature. He served as Speaker of the House and President of the Senate. And he was a Democrat from Palmer. So, and it was in the 90s where he was defeated by Lyda Green. And that is like a turning point where from that point forward, the Mat-Su was reliably Republican. But so all around this time period, there are big sea changes happening in the way voting blocks in Alaska are organized.
Yeah, and I wasn't here, but I would assume there's so many other factors. Like, I bet a lot of new people were moving to Wasilla. What was the industry driving there? What was the price points driving them? These are all things that drive the changes in communities, especially in their political beliefs.
I think where we're going is a Supreme Court decision in the 90s that said that the right to privacy in the Alaska state constitution protected the right to abortion.
Yes. And so then that's where we continue to see legislative pieces trying to whittle away at that, and the Alaska State Supreme Court taking them down, saying it's unconstitutional. And also the equity part of our Constitution does a lot of heavy lifting that people don't realize, that everyone has to be treated equitably. So that's also why, abortion is a covered service, because if you're a pregnant person, the state has no right to tell you which medical services that are safe you can access and which you can't. So if they're going to allow people to access OBGYN appointments, and ultrasounds, etc., to carry their wanted pregnancy to term, then all of the gamut of services for a pregnant person have to be applied because of equal protection. So, yeah, I like the equal protection clause.
The impetus for you coming in today was to talk about the budget reconciliation bill that is being amended in the Senate. It was passed through the House by one vote and is being amended in the Senate. And a version should be going back to the House for concurrence and then on to President Trump's desk. I think the timeline they're looking for is to try to have that on his desk by July 4th. If no changes are made, what would be the impact of the current budget, the big, beautiful bill, as the Republicans call it, on Planned Parenthood in Alaska?
Currently, the bill has a complete removal of Planned Parenthood from the Medicaid program, and that's nationwide. What that will look like is about a third of Planned Parenthood's closing.
Which is about 200 clinics.
Yeah. However, where those will be varies by affiliate. Affiliates are the locations of Planned Parenthoods. We're Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky. What will happen here is still to be determined. A third of Planned Parenthood Alaska's patient base is on Medicaid. We also were removed previously from Title X program, which a lot of times people were like, I came to you and I couldn't afford care and I got it for free. What was actually happening was a government program was covering the cost of that care for you. Trump had taken Planned Parenthood out of it in his first term, and so that was planned for. So that was
knowing that he was going to do that again in the second term.
So we knew he was going to do it. When he did it, it was in the business model to stay open, in the financial model of us projecting what their patient bases would look like. So what this means is unclear for Alaska. There is absolutely no plan to close any of the health centers in Alaska. But a third of patients losing care is a big deal and is scary, but is also not certain yet. Like, this bill hasn't passed. Not only does it remove Planned Parenthood from Medicaid, it guts Medicaid in general. There's just so many things in this budget that are not caring for communities. They're not,
and have a disproportionate effect on Alaska.
Yes.
My understanding is that one of the provisions in the budget is that whereas Medicaid funds couldn't be used for abortions, it states that providers who perform abortions cannot receive Medicaid funding, meaning even if they were doing pap smears, those providers cannot bill Medicaid in any way, shape, or form.
Yes.
That's where the huge deficit would come in is that the only folks performing abortions in Alaska are Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah. So we're the only provider of abortion. No federal funds go to abortion. The Hyde Amendment has been there forever. So it's not about abortion, and it is about abortion with this defunding of Planned Parenthood from Medicaid. So that means that Planned Parenthood is not in the Medicaid program. We are the largest provider of sexual and reproductive health care. This idea that if we're not taking these Medicaid patients, then they can go somewhere else is patently false. There's data, and other health centers are speaking up to say that. Simply for the STI testing and treatments that we do, other community health centers would have to increase their ability to take cases 183%. And with provider shortages, it's not just like they have a magic 100 open STI spots at X health center to take our patients. It means people just won't get that care.
Well, it was Dan Sullivan's office specifically that said that they believed that federally qualified health centers could take these patients.
And that's not true.
Which would be like Anchorage Neighborhood Health Clinic. I want to read the quote. Sullivan is working to ensure that federally qualified community health centers can, quote, continue to provide women's health services, but did not respond to a question on whether the center would be able to fill the void created if the Anchorage or Fairbanks Planned Parenthood clinics were to close.
And that's not my opinion. That is numbers. Our patient volume is twice as much as almost all of the other health centers combined for these services. It's not just STI testing and screening, but it's also the fact that do they provide all the services we provide? Not every healthcare center that provides birth control provides the full range of it. So now you can't take hormonal birth control for, either it's not your choice or it doesn't work for you. Is there a place to get an IUD? Is there a place to get a different form of birth control? Because not all of the health centers offer all of our services. And then you mix that in again with provider shortages, but also the fact that a lot of health centers have a cap on how many Medicaid patients they'll take. Right? And if they've already reached that cap, then where are those patients going to go?
When you were speaking earlier about the 80s and having 13 or 14 different clinics that could perform abortions, and today having 2, any way that you slice it, Alaska has lost access to care.
Yeah. And also, the state is really proud of its legal access and needs to be honest with itself about its practical access. Because people living off the road system, people in unsafe relationships who maybe didn't even know we existed, didn't know abortion clinics were here, how to find them. So it's never been equal. It's never been accessible for everyone. It's just been legally there. And we always should have been working on expanding that access.
Senator Lisa Murkowski has been very supportive of Planned Parenthood. She remains very supportive of Planned Parenthood and has stated that any change by the Trump administration to limit federal funding for abortion providers would, quote, further limit critical access to healthcare services in Alaska. This bill is in the Senate. It's still being crafted. And the vote that Alaska needs is from Dan Sullivan.
Yeah, what they both need to hear, Senator Murkowski did unequivocally come out many times, but in this most recent DN article, support of Planned Parenthood and access to reproductive health care. And so a thank you, how can we help? And Dan Sullivan needs to know that he is elected to represent his constituents, not his own personal beliefs. It is overwhelming that his constituents want Planned Parenthood to stay in Alaska. They want Medicaid to be funded. He doesn't get to, he gets to, because he can vote however he wants once he's elected there. But constituents should remind him that he was elected to vote in their best interest. There is a lot in this bill that is bad for Alaska. Not just the Medicaid piece.
Right. I talked about this. I had an episode with Zach Fields specifically about the budget reconciliation bill a couple of weeks ago. What Representative Fields' point was, they don't have a bill to vote on yet. What needs to happen is that bad things in the bill need to be taken out, and then the bill can be voted on. He feels strongly that Dan Sullivan has a lot of power in deciding what stays in the bill and what doesn't. And if I were to tell people listening, when you send the email, say that Dan Sullivan has a lot of power and that there's things that he can do that no other senator can do. and that he should use that power to make sure that Alaska is not harmed by this budget.
Yeah, I agree with that. When he's shown us that power in the past during the Medicaid expansion, he, worked to get, things that would be harmful for Alaska changed for Alaska. So he absolutely can do that again. And he can even extend that power to not just care about his own constituents, but the health of the entire Medicaid program. Even if Alaska gets more money now, a failing system is going to fail. I also believe that even though you're elected to protect your constituents' best interests, it doesn't have to be an either or. You can do what's best for Alaska and what's best for all the other states.
Well, Rose O'Hare Jolly, thank you so much for being on the show today. Do you have a book to recommend?
Oh, I always love the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles.
Oh, by Murakami?
Yeah.
It's so good.
And then I'm currently reading a bunch of books and my brain scrambled and was like, which one should I remember? I also really love Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And that's a book that I've read at different stages in my life and continues to resonate. But she also did live like 40 miles from where I was born. So I feel it in my soul when she describes the swamp and everything around them.
Well, 2 great books. Thank you so much for recommending them. And thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
The 2 books recommended by our guest today were The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.